Well, I'm a sociologist, and I study adult human development across the life course with particular emphasis on aging well and dying well. Well, I started out with my dissertation research. My dissertation research was focused on life satisfaction in old age. And I was wondering, wanted to find out what determines life satisfaction in old age. And as a sociologist, we typically look at what I would call objective life conditions, like, people's socioeconomic status, their financial situation, their gender, their health, really important, their education, their connection in the community, and all those might be important to a certain degree, but I also thought, well, there might be something else, right? And so I was thinking about other concepts like coping. Coping was interesting. But then I came, I said, well, maybe it's something like wisdom, right? And then I said, well, yeah, it might be wisdom, but how do you study this? How do you measure this, right? And I went to the library to pick up a book for my study. And right next to it was this Sternberg edited book on wisdom, its nature, development, and something else. And I said, wow, this is great. People are actually studying wisdom. So I got the book and I read it, and I noticed that people were actually confused what wisdom is. I mean, there was not one unifying definition of wisdom. So they were all over the place. But a lot of people referred back to a study by Clayton and Biren done in the 1980s, actually. And so I got this article, a book chapter, and in this study, basically what they did, they asked first a group of younger and older people what wisdom is, and then they took those characteristics and ask another group of younger and older people how characteristic these qualities are for a wise person, for an old person, and for myself, basically. And then they did a multidimensional scaling analysis, and what they found out that wisdom consisted of kind of what they decided to call 3 dimensions, and they called it cognitive, reflective, and the affective dimension. And when I read this, I thought, wow, maybe you cannot measure wisdom directly, but you could certainly measure the cognitive, reflective, and the affective dimension of wisdom. And that's what I, basically started doing with the data set that I had, which was a longitudinal data set, and I used the California Q-sort and the ego reading scales to come up with cognitive characteristics and reflective characteristics and affective characteristics, which I now call compassionate characteristics of wisdom. And the combination of those characteristics, I called this wisdom. And indeed, it was the strongest predictors of life satisfaction in old age. And that was the beginning. And then from there, I started, actually one of my colleagues, John Henretta, said, well, why don't you come up, and develop a scale that measures wisdom, because these were ratings, ego rating scales, California Q-sort, and it takes quite a while, and so it would be nice to have a scale just to give it out like in a questionnaire. I said, okay, and so I looked at all possible published questionnaires that might fit into those 3 dimensions, and started out with 140 items, and then gave those 140 items to 180 older people, and tested the items, and then reduced them to 39, and this is the 3-dimensional wisdom scale that I developed then. And I have used them in research ever since. So in some ways, I know you started out the question, how did you come from human development? Actually, how do you come from sociology to study this? Because I studied, when I studied for my PhD in sociology, I studied with Glenn Elder, who is the life course researcher. And I was fascinated by life course research, basically, looking at aging well from a life course perspective. So not just how did it happen, that people have high life satisfaction in old age based on their conditions right now, but maybe based on their conditions that they had all through their lives. And so wisdom is inherently a developmental concept, at least we think, right? It develops with time. You're not born with it, but it should grow when you get older. And so in this way, how people have dealt with life, all their lives, should then show up in how successful they age and also how successful they might die. Well, there are some people who would argue, and that's Juan Pascal Leone. He has argued that there are basically two paths to wisdom. And one is through what he calls ultimate limit situations. And these are situations, crisis and what I call crisis and obstacles in life, but really more devastating than that. I would argue, actually, that wisdom also develops through the minor crises and obstacles in life. Basically learning from negative experiences in life. You can also learn from positive experiences, but the negative experiences are probably that jolt people out of their everyday rut and sometimes might force them to change priorities. Somebody loses a job at midlife and questions what is really important in life, and then they start a new career and something that might be more meaningful, whereas in the first half they just wanted to earn money. In the second half of life, after losing the job, they actually might want to contribute to society. And so in this regard, he's arguing that these ultimate limit situations, or another example is being diagnosed with a terminal illness that really shakes people up, right? Particularly if it's not happens at 80 or 90. At 80 or 90, it's not so bad. But if it happens earlier in life, this really shakes people up. And so they ask, they might question themselves, what's really important in my life? And they often change priorities. They change how they live. Sometimes they change jobs. And in this way, he would argue that this is one pathway to wisdom. The other pathway, what he would argue, is meditation. So basically, it's like, well, he would say, we don't necessarily have to have those traumatic experiences. You can just sit and reflect in this way what is important to you and how to overcome negativity in your own life without necessarily having this really big event. But yeah, so negative experiences can actually be the teacher that help you to develop more wisdom. And so sometimes people say learning from experiences is really important to develop wisdom, but the key is exactly learning from experiences, not just having experiences. It also doesn't mean that every negative experiences will actually automatically lead to wisdom. It could also lead to really despair and devastation. So it's not automatic, but in some ways, if the person wants to grow through the experience, and that leads to post-traumatic growth, stress-related growth, or all these kind of names, then there is a higher chance that there also is a development toward greater wisdom. Yeah, I think that's a good example what you're giving when you say inner city youth might they have a lot of negative experience, or people in a war zone or something, they have a lot of negative experiences. Do they all automatically become wiser? Not necessarily, because one of the problems is that there also need to be some resources, and some space to reflect on it. And one of the things probably what helps a lot is support, some kind of social support. And if this social support is there, and particularly, I think we know from inner city youth, if there is a mentor, particularly a male mentor, and of course if there's a father present, it's much better than if there's not a father present. But even if the father is not present, but there is a male mentor who can help the youth, to show them what the right path is and how to overcome obstacles and challenges, that they are exposed all the time. then they are more likely to succeed than if the gang leader becomes the mentor. If the gang leader becomes the mentor, then they are also learning something, but they might not be learning the path toward wisdom, right? And so I think social support, a community that helps you to grow through the experience, to negative experience, so that you don't have to go through it alone, that's really, really important, and that can be, another example would be, exactly what they do sometimes in those war zones. They have, bringing people together, and I know they have done this, I think, in Israel, bringing Palestinians and Israelis together, and they're talking about it and trying to get to a, common understanding that we are all human in this, we all kind of want the same things. And what they did in South Africa, after apartheid ended, and having kind of reconciliation, this commission, and that probably helps people to grow in wisdom rather than reinforcing separation. This is the enemy and this is us, and we have nothing in common. So yes, I think support helps. I define wisdom as a combination of cognitive, reflective, and compassionate dimension. And so the cognitive dimension is knowing something, but it's not necessarily knowing a lot or knowing about how the universe originated or the latest news in quantum physics, but it's knowing deeper. And so deeper about the human condition and the deeper meaning of life. So for example, the philosopher Kekus says wise people don't necessarily know than other people, but they know the deeper meaning of what everybody else knows. So a good example is we are all mortal, right? So we all know that we are mortal, but deep down we really don't believe that I personally am mortal, right? We think, yeah, everybody else is mortal, but not me, right? I'm immortal. And then we are surprised, if we get the news that, no, now it's your turn. But wise people understand that, no, they understand the meaning of we are all mortal, and they live their lives accordingly. And that means that they set priorities according to that their life will end eventually, and they also recognize that the lives of all their loved ones will eventually end. And they, again, they live their lives in a way that appreciates maybe other people in a deeper way. So wise people know about what other people have also called the intra and interpersonal aspects of life. So they know about other people, how to relate to other people, but they also understand themselves. And all wisdom traditions would always say, know thyself. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Know thyself. And know thyself means to really look deep into oneself and understand who I am at a really deep level. And for that, you need the reflective component of wisdom. And the reflective component of wisdom basically means looking at things from different perspectives, but also looking at yourself from an outside perspective, and which requires self-reflection and self-examination. If you do that, you realize that you don't only have positive aspects, but also some negative aspects, right? And by accepting this, that there are positive and negative aspects in you, you reduce your ego-centeredness and also become more tolerant toward other people who might also be not perfect, right? So once you can accept that you are not perfect, it's easier to accept that other people aren't perfect either. And that leads to the compassionate component, which I basically define as sympathy and compassion for others, so that you can actually develop compassion for other people, for their own faults and weaknesses, and can help them to lead a better life, or whatever you can do. So those three components I would define as wisdom, but the combination of the three components. I think they can be both, right? So, I mean, social media is social media, so it can be used for good or not so good. From the cognitive perspectives, you know, knowing something about yourself or others, I think there are so many resources on the internet. You know, for example, you know, there are a lot of wisdom teachers out there that you can podcasts that you can download on YouTube that you can watch. You know, and so you can actually get the teachings, you know, of wise persons directly over the internet, and that, of course, promotes the cognitive aspect. You know more about life. And then the reflective component, you know, looking at things from different perspectives. So the internet gives you all this knowledge, right? So you can look at all the different perspectives. You can search out, okay, this is my perspective, what is the other's perspective? So you can look at all these perspectives. There is no end to it, really. And then the compassionate component, I think, again, the internet brought the world closer together. Our grandparents' age, you know, when they grew up, the next town, and this is in Germany, but the next town was the enemy, right? And now, you know, I mean, we have contact with people all over the world. And if you see people, for example, on YouTube in Syria or so, you know, see them suffering from the war and from conflict or from a natural disaster in Haiti or so, it brings it closer to home, and that develops more, you know, you might be able to develop more sympathy and compassion in this way because you actually see those people. They are not just some nameless, faceless people all over the world. So in this way, I think it can actually promote wisdom by you know, making it more real. But on the other hand, it can also prevent the development of wisdom because if people only search out their own opinion, so then it's not broaden their horizon, right? It's not looking at different perspectives, but you're only looking out your own opinion, you know. And since, you know, all the opinions are present, you might have the feeling, yes, there are other people who think like me, and therefore my fringe, you know, opinion is actually quite popular, or it's almost, you know, the mainstream or whatever. And it might distort what's actually valid and true. And even things that are not true are actually quite on the internet. And so, you know, I don't know, the earth is flat, you know, I think the earth, you know, some people think the earth is flat or the earth is the center of the universe. This is out there on the internet, you know, there's a website saying, I will prove to you that the earth is the center of the universe. And so, and that can actually narrow the view and make people more closed-minded rather than open-minded. And then the same with the compassionate component. You know, if you only look out, you actually kind of vilify the enemy rather than looking at whatever the enemy might be, right? Rather than looking at the human component. That will not broaden the perspective and make you more compassionate, but might make you actually more prejudiced toward other people. And that's actually something I'm struggling with. What's really encouraging for me is that people in business are becoming interested in wisdom. Now, people so far, they are more in academic, you know, in business schools, but they're becoming interested in this topic, and particularly in regard to ethics. You know, and is wisdom related to ethics? I would say absolutely. Because if you have a broader perspective, if you develop sympathy and compassion for others, if you look at things from different perspectives and see what's really important in life, I think then wise people would not think, well, for lack of a better word, wise to be unethical, because people who are unethical actually harm themselves in the long run, or even in the short run, by cheating somebody out of money, and that can be wage theft. I mean, this can be legal, right? When people get now all kinds of ways to cheat workers out of their money by making them contractors, by low wage jobs, and they are contractors, and therefore they don't have to pay, the companies don't have to pay overhead and these kind of things. It's just, I cannot imagine that in the end that this feels good, right, to cheat people out. Whereas, being generous typically feels good. So this is with this thing with this altruism, sometimes we have the debate, does altruism really exist? Because every time you do something good, you feel good, right? So is it really doing something without expecting anything in return? But the key is, of course, expecting. And yes, it typically feels better to do good for other people. Whereas if you cheat other people, it's there. It doesn't lead to happiness, and in the end, I think well-being. That's the reason why we want to develop wisdom. That's why I'm interested in aging well and dying well, and so people who are only in there for the money and doing as much as they can for the bottom line, meaning the money, rather than actually running a business to benefit others. Why do you want to run a business? I mean, what's the actual purpose of a business? If it's to make money, so what for, right? And for whom, And if it's just for you and you already have, 100 million, why do you need another 10? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, from a point. But running a business in order to provide a service, because you want to actually provide a service for others, or to help your workers so that they can make a good living, I think that's what a wise person say is the real purpose of business. And if, in general, if a business would be run in this way, I think we would have much less problems in terms of inequality. There's now a different term, I don't know what's it called, I think social business or something like this. It's not a non-profit, it's a for-profit business, but it's run in a way to actually provide a service to others, to give back to the community, and to actually pay a living wage. And there are a couple of examples, like Ben & Jerry's is a good example, where they have this in their mission statement, how they want to. And so I think if more and more companies are doing it, and if people decide that it's more worthwhile buying from those companies, the whole business atmosphere could shift, and the whole economy could shift in a more equal direction. Now, when is this going to happen? I don't know. But right now, we are going in the opposite direction, right? But where is the bottom, right? I mean, at one point, why do companies, for example, hoard money right now and they don't invest? Why don't they invest? Well, because people don't have the money to buy. Why don't they have the money to buy? Because they don't get enough in wages, right? So in the end, it doesn't work. If you cut off the cycle, if there are some people who take all the money, and a lot of people don't have enough of money to actually spend, then the whole capitalistic system breaks actually down. So they are actually ruining their own capitalistic system in this way. So, eventually, I think it will have to change, and let's hope that those businesses who actually have a more social conscious, that they actually will take over and become more and more, rather than the others who just are there to make a lot of money and exploit the workers. Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point, right? I mean, you should integrate wisdom into daily living. If you don't do that, then I mean, how else, right, can you live a wise life? In fact, I think wisdom is really bottom-up approach. You cannot command wisdom from the top, right? We now have a wisdom society and everybody is wise. This just doesn't work. It is a really bottom-up approach, so that people, every person who, I mean, the idea is that by developing wisdom, it will be easier for people to cope with negative events in their lives. And this is why I'm interested in old age, because eventually, even if you have a completely charmed life, even if you belong to the 1%ers and have all the money in the world, eventually, right, people will get older and be confronted by decline, by sickness, right, by loss of status and all kinds of things. And then, wisdom comes in very handy. One of the research that I found is that, for example, I compared an older group of community residents with a group of hospice patients and nursing home residents. And I found that wisdom had a greater effect on subjective well-being in old age for the nursing home and hospice patients and for the community residents. And the reason this is, I think, is first of all, it's harder to be wise being in the nursing home, quite frankly, and to still continue looking at things from different perspectives, developing sympathy and compassion for others. It's harder. And so nursing home and hospice patients had, on average, scored lower in wisdom than the community residents. But if they had wisdom, they were more likely to have a higher subjective well-being than those in the community. In community, the relationship was still significant, but it was significantly weaker than in the end-of-life sample. And I think the reason for this is if you live in the community and you're relatively healthy, you still can find other ways of increasing your subjective well-being by traveling, by going to the theater or to the cinema or meeting with other people, having fun, going to restaurants, right? This all can increase subjective well-being. But in the nursing home or being in a hospice patient, being diagnosed with having only 6 months or less to live, it's much harder to increase subjective well-being if the inner strength that wisdom provides is missing. And so wisdom is particularly valuable in these circumstances. And another study that we did with Dilip Jester from University California in San Diego, and we are looking at, again, it's a community sample of older adults in the San Diego area. But then we were asking a question if, did you experience any negative stressful life events during the past year? And if yes, how much did it affect you, negatively affect you? And for those who scored high on wisdom, and if they also had negative effects, it did not negatively affect their subjective well-being. Whereas those who did not have wisdom, stressful life events did indeed negatively affect their subjective well-being. So again, it means that wisdom is particularly valuable in times of stress and hardships. And this is why, yes, in everyday life, little things can happen, little negative things can happen all the time, or big things can happen. And then wisdom becomes really valuable. Well, it's just a simple example, right? You're in traffic, driving along, somebody cuts you off. Do you really get riled up about it, or do you just say, all right, maybe he was just busy, or he just didn't know, or he's just an ignorant person, or whatever, and you don't get riled up. This is better, for your blood pressure and, your immune system, all this kind of thing. So yes, it's really valuable.
Great. So I'm going to come back to this other question that we had missed. So in one of your articles in 2004, it was written about wisdom as expert knowledge system. You discuss wisdom theory. And then in it you explain the difference between explicit and implicit theories of wisdom. Can you just explain a little bit about the idea of wisdom as an expert knowledge system compared to
Well, okay. Well, wisdom as an expert knowledge system is really Paul Balter's definition of wisdom, right? So late Paul Balter's. And he defined it as an expert knowledge system coming from the expert literature. And I understand how he came to this concept from expertise and wisdom as particular expertise in knowledge. And they also called it, an explicit theory of wisdom, because they came up with it looking at the literature of wisdom and of expert knowledge, whereas implicit theories of wisdom are derived from asking lay people, what do you think wisdom is? And then, looking at the characteristics, what they name, and then doing either what Clayton and Bierman did, multidimensional scaling analysis, and coming up with the 3-dimension, or other people, have done a factor analysis and coming up with other 5 factors or something like this. And so this is the difference between the explicit. Some experts come up with a definition of wisdom, or implicit theories. Lay people come up with, say to researchers what they think wisdoms are, and then the researchers summarize it. And my critique was that the wisdom as expert knowledge system is a little bit too much emphasis on knowledge and not enough emphasis on the caring, compassionate aspects of wisdom. And that was basically what I wanted to introduce in the theories of wisdom, this extra element. I think, yes, the idea is that wisdom comes with age is because if we say that wisdom is learning from experiences, right? You have to have a couple of experiences in order to learn from it. But it doesn't automatically develop with age. As we know, a lot of older people are not necessarily wise. And not everybody learns from their experiences. For some people, experiences or negative experiences can really be devastating. So in this way, yes, there is a positive relationship, and I'm not sure if there is a critical period. Even so, it looks like I've seen a couple of data now that suggest a curvilinear relationship between wisdom and age, and that the peak is around, depending on education, 50 or 60 or something. Why would it go down again, right? Now, these are cross-sectional data. This could be a cohort effect. Maybe it's the baby boomers, have developed some wisdom and the others not. I don't know. But it also could be, that, remember, it's one of the definitions, reflection, looking at things from different perspectives, having sympathy and compassion for others. If things don't go so well anymore with oneself, if one develops a terminal illness or a physical disability or things like this, it might be much harder to look at things from different perspectives and continue to develop sympathy and compassion for others, rather than just focus on oneself and say, okay, now I have to just take care of my own, right, first. Looking out for number one. And that might be related to this, that it kind of goes down later in life. And I wonder, I haven't really looked at this. Now, of course, we do know that some older adults do have high wisdom, even in hospice, even in the nursing home. And I haven't really looked very closely at this. Why is this the case? And what are the characteristics of these people? This is something I need to do. But the other thing is also that, sometimes people say, can young people be wise? Absolutely. But it often comes at a price. You often see these young adults that, that we call wise beyond their years, and they often have gone through very traumatic experiences, but learn from it. Sometimes young adults or teenagers who get diagnosed with a terminal illness, they really make some progress in terms of developing wisdom. And you really would, when you talk to them, you think, oh my God, right? They really have deep insights. Where does it come from? Well, they might, through their terminal illness, they might actually have looked deep into themselves and meaning of life and why are we here and things like this, and developed a lot of wisdom in this regard. But it's hard. I remember many, many years ago, I read an article in Newsweek about a presentation by the Dalai Lama somewhere in California. He gave a presentation, I think. And after the talk, somebody asked him, what is the fastest way to enlightenment? And Newsweek he described, after the question was asked, he wept. He wept. And the Newsweek's comment was, well, some people just don't get it, right? But I think he wept because the fastest way to enlightenment is by going through some really traumatic negative experiences, those ultimate limit situations, you know, that Pascal Leone talks about. And that's hard. So it's a really, you know, it's a high price to pay for a fast development of wisdom. So personally, you know, I might want to take the slow route to wisdom.